Okay, so we'll start over again now that you can hear me. Um, Three things I want to mention before we get into this. The first one is that trigger warning, I suppose, if you want to call it that. If you've been a part of abuse, if you've gone through abuse at all, this is, as you probably know, gonna be difficult. So just keep that in mind as we go into this. It's not gonna be easy. Okay, so the other thing I want to mention is I know the Royce report put a timeline at the bottom of this report, which I appreciate. I appreciate a lot, right? For people like me, like I said when I did the other videos, it's almost necessary because of the way they're set up. So I appreciate that she put a report down at the bottom with the timeline. I wanted to do a bit more of a detailed timeline. And honestly, I just wanted to do a timeline myself. This is just me sharing my information that I got from it with you guys. It's not that you can't get this information yourself. In fact, what I would tell all of you, as I've told everyone that's watched the videos, please just go read all of the linkable reports yourself. All of them. Some of them are very difficult. Some of them are hard to get through. The problem is, though, you need to read them. Okay. Don't take her word for it. Don't take my word for it. Don't take anybody. Go read them yourself. Okay. So at least you're knowledgeable of them. So yes, she put a timeline at the bottom. I want to do a timeline. The third thing rather, what I want to do is this whole first section, the long part of this video. This is going to be a longer video. No like flashy lights or anything. It's just me talking to you. So if that bores you, you might want to come watch it later. But the long part of this first half of this video is just going to be me putting on the screen the facts that we get from the report, and I'm going to save my opinions till the end. Now, I can assure all of you, regardless of what side you're on, I'm probably going to make you mad. That's not my intent. My intent, as it was with the first video that I did, was just to dig in to what she put out there. If John MacArthur's wrong, I want to know that John MacArthur's wrong. If there's something that needs to be called out, I want to know that there's something to be called out. However, I don't want to just take someone's word for it, and I don't want to just fall on a side because it's the side that I would normally fall on. I want to look at the information. I want to use biblical discernment and say, okay, what from this can I pull out and say, is any of this redeemable? Is this true? Is this false? Like, what can I get from all of this information? That would be hopefully be all of our goals, is to do that. So we're going to start now, just so you have that sort of warning at the beginning here. You're going to be mad, not necessarily at me or MacArthur or anything. There's things in this report that are upsetting, and it's just terrifying to think about the reality that people like this exist and they are out there. And unfortunately, they're clearly in some churches. So we're going to start. Okay, let's start now. So we have to go all the way back to 1960 to even begin with what we're looking at. In 1960, Paul Guez, I'm saying his name right, Guez, his first wife, says that while Paul was in college at Pacific Christian College, he was asked to leave a couple different churches because of his pursuit of high school girls in youth groups. It was almost an obsession of his, she stated, that he would like pursue them. When they got married, apparently, and again, this is in her statement, she was young, but she quickly found out that he was he was very like overbearing on her. Now, only 4 years later after this, okay, Donna, which is his sister, says that Paul attempted to assault her by climbing on top of her while they were at a family friend, like a family's house visiting, but she shoved him off. Now, this is his sister. Now, this information that happened in 1964, we don't find out about, nobody finds out about until 2003. But just so you have a timeline of what happens, 4 years after he gets married to his first wife, he attempts to assault his sister. Paul does. Now, that same year, Paul gets on at a church, a youth group, and as he's in this youth group, sort of as an intern, Paul sleeps with and impregnates a student at the church. Her name was Jane, and Jane actually becomes his second wife. Now, it's a long, drawn-out story, but essentially what occurs is Paul goes to Las Vegas, marries Jane, but because of how state laws work, his divorce with his first wife isn't actually finalized until later, and we'll get to that. In that same year, okay, so this is all is happening in 1964. Paul forces himself onto Pam, which is actually Wendy's 7-year-old cousin. Now, when I say forces or abused in this video, just imagine the M word that I cannot say on YouTube without getting banned. Okay, this is what Paul's doing. Paul Guay. This is a history building up that we need to understand. Now, this is what happens in 64. Now, we skip forward to 1966. His divorce to his first wife, which was in California, finally gets like annulled because that's how long it took in California at the time to do that. And he's currently married to Jane, which is the girl he got pregnant in the youth group. They're now married. Now, if you read, what I would encourage you to do is find Paul's first wife's like her statement. It's very informative. It's very helpful. I think it sheds a lot of light on the situation. But anyway, that's when he finally gets the finalized divorce. Now, in 1977, we have 11 years later, all right, Wendy, which is his daughter, moves out of her mom's house and into her dad's house. So she moves from Oregon to California because she wants to. That's the only thing we have. She wants to move to California. And she says that the abuse that she endures from her father starts almost immediately when she moves in. Now, again, if you want more details on the abuse, there's detailed reports in the report, but just again, for the sake of YouTube in this video. Now, 2 years after that, so the abuse has been happening for 2 years. 2 years after that, Wendy's friend Lisa spends the night and wakes up with Paul, which is Wendy's dad, standing over them. And then that same time frame, Wendy tells Lisa about the abuse that has been happening. So let's just frame this really quick. Paul's a terrible person, clearly. I don't think anybody would assume otherwise. Paul is clearly a messed up dude that's got a lot of problems. At this time, though, Paul has gone from church to church to church, and he's ended up somehow in 1979 at Grace Community Church. Paul is currently employed there. What happens here on August 5th through the 10th, these dates are like within 5 days, a lot of things happen. This is the first event that happens where Lisa or Wendy tells her friend Lisa about the abuse that's been going on. Okay. Now, Lisa tells her dad, his name is John Tucker. He goes to Grace Community Church. He's gone there for a while. And John tells Wendy to call her mom immediately. Now, again, it doesn't state in the reports anywhere why the law enforcement wasn't called, anything like that. I'm sure it has something to do with like just the time frame that it's in, as far as in the early 80s, late 70s. But he tells her to call her mom immediately. So she does. And her mom buys a plane ticket immediately back to Oregon. Now, what we're seeing here is all the things that should have happened in regards to people trying to help Wendy get out of this situation. So again, in this time frame, August 5th through the 10th, after finding out about her abuse, her mom tries to call Grace Community Church, but she can't reach John MacArthur. She can't reach the church at all. They won't return her calls. So she calls John Tucker, which is a member of Grace Community Church, and she calls her brother-in-law, which his name is Gary Davis, and he's a pastor in the area, right? So she's reaching out to the people she knows that can hopefully make a difference and say, hey, Paul, which is employed here at your church, he has done these terrible things. Now, right now, keep in mind, we know the 3,000-foot view. We know about Pam being abused. We know about Donna attempted to be abused. We know about Wendy being abused. And we know about Paul's history way back when he was in college with pursuing teenage girls. Like, we know that. Right now, though, the only thing Wendy knows is that it's her, which is plenty enough information. But just know that, like, that's all they know right then, is that it's her. And they're trying to help her. So they get with John Tucker and they get with Gary Davies and they say, hey, what can you do? Can you help us out here? So Gary Davies, which is her brother-in-law, he's a pastor in the area. He says he contacts somebody at Grace Community Church, somebody in the leadership team. He doesn't say who, he doesn't give a name, but he says nothing's done about it at all. So John Tucker, apparently Wendy's mom reaches out to John Tucker and he decides to confront Paul and drives to Paul's house. He says that Paul admits to the abuse, and then John Tucker asks Paul to go with him and meet with John MacArthur. Now, there's something here that's not in the report that is in Wendy's mother's letter, which she states in her letter that when Paul talked to MacArthur, he denied doing anything. That's her words in her letter, that Paul denied doing anything at first to MacArthur when he talked to MacArthur. John Tucker states that when they went for the meeting, Paul admitted everything to John MacArthur. So there's some conflicting things going on here. Now, again, within the report, what we have on the Roche report, as far as on the actual article, without clicking into the links, what we have is the information that Paul confessed to John MacArthur. That seems to be the accurate story. And her mom might be talking about the time before when she was trying to call Grace Community Church. But at some point, Paul denied doing it to what Wendy's mom calls the lead pastor, but that has to be MacArthur. So Wendy is aware, apparently, that this conversation is going to take place. They have to set it up. She knows it's happening. She writes in her diary that she's concerned about it. She's nervous about it. And one thing that you'll notice as we go through here, I'm assuming you've read the report. If you haven't, you're watching this for this information. One thing you're going to notice is that Wendy is a saint. All through this, Wendy is assuming the best of people. She's assuming the best of her dad. She's trying to get her dad help. She's assuming the best of the church, that they're in for her best interest. She's assuming the best for everybody. Like she's not thinking anybody's out to get her at this point. I mean, she's a saint. She's concerned, though. She's concerned that her dad's going to get in trouble. She's concerned that it's going to be awkward. And she writes that in her diary during this time frame. Now, Wendy records that she had written her dad an 8-page letter on August 15th. Okay. So the meeting hasn't happened yet, apparently, with Paul, with John Tucker or John MacArthur. That hasn't happened yet, but apparently she writes a letter to her dad on August 15th that's 8 pages, letting him know how she feels about everything he's done. It's just, I guess, a letter to get stuff off her chest. And according to her, he calls it garbage and doesn't accept it at all. And then we have on August 25th, John Tucker, Paul, I have Guy, but Gway, and John MacArthur meet. And Paul, according to Tucker, confesses to John MacArthur everything he confessed to him when he confronted him just a few days before. And then there's a meeting of sorts, and Tucker and MacArthur agreed that MacArthur is going to take over this discipleship and this care for Paul, as far as like discipleship and discipline. That's the agreement. Now, the same day this happens, so the meeting gets out, and Paul calls Wendy after that and tells her that he confessed everything to MacArthur and Tucker. And Wendy, in her diary, is really, really relieved by this. She is happy. She's happy for a couple reasons. One, that it's out in the open. She seems happy that her dad's going to get help. She seems happy that MacArthur's going to help him and work it out. You can tell that she looks up to John MacArthur a lot, not just in her early ages, but we'll see this as we go on. But she's on August 25th. Her dad calls her and tells her, and she's excited about this. Now, okay, hold on. I'm sorry. I had a duplicate slide here. Now, on August 29th, Wendy receives a vague letter from MacArthur talking about the conversation he had with her dad and her dad as a godly man and all of that. Also, I apologize for how small this text is. I thought I made it bigger on this slide, but I clearly didn't. Now, this letter, this is pivotal. The meeting with John Tucker and Paul Gway and John MacArthur is a pivotal moment for sure. But this is also a pivotal moment because it is John MacArthur not only having a meeting with Paul Gway that's confirmed by John Tucker, and John MacArthur will later confirm that he did have a meeting with Paul. So now this isn't some John MacArthur, like by association, guilty because something happened. This is John MacArthur in the room with people that are accused of doing the thing. And then he writes this letter. Now, this letter, we'll find out later, not until 2003, but again, we have the 3,000-foot view, so we know. Wendy writes him a letter, John MacArthur specifically. She labels that letter private and sends it to him. And she writes private on the envelope, she says, so that nobody but him will open it. And the reason she writes private on the letter so nobody else will open it is because it's detailing, she says, the abuse that her dad put her through. And she sends that to him and gets another letter back from him. Now you can read it, but the letter is super, super vague. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the key issue here is that he does write her a letter back, acknowledging that he received the letter she sent him. And there's some stuff in there that you can read it. It's just kind of like you're going to want to read it. I mean, you just will. It's hard to read, but basically, it's just all positive things, basically, about her dad and about forgiving her dad and all of that. And she keeps it. She keeps it and she files that letter. Now, on August 30th of 1979, again, I apologize for the font. I thought I made this bigger too, but Wendy's journal entry indicates that she's feeling better about the situation. And she feels like this is sort of a turning point. Not only has her dad admitted to the pastors and to her friend's dad that he did this, but like there seems like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Like there's help for her dad, which ultimately again is like, again, she's a saint. That's what she wanted. She wanted her dad to get better. Even though he did these things to her, that was her heart, for him to get better. And she thinks that this is a turning point for that because she's met with John MacArthur. She's admitted, or he's admitted, that he did these things. And that's August 30th, 1979. Now we have a huge gap of time of 3 years. One of the important parts of the handwritten letter that John MacArthur sends her is that her dad will stay on staff. So John MacArthur doesn't fire Paul Guay after finding out about, well, we'll get to that, but he doesn't fire Paul Guay at all, even though Paul admitted something to John MacArthur that apparently was pretty bad, because John Tucker wouldn't have taken Paul Guay to see John MacArthur if it wasn't bad. And the interesting part here is that in one of the emails, and we'll talk about those as we get through this timeline, but just to kind of fill you in, one of those emails, Wendy mentions that John Tucker and his wife his family leaves Grace Community Church. That's not mentioned in the report, but it is mentioned in one of the emails. And Wendy is assuming the reason that they leave is because Paul Guay wasn't fired. She actually says at the time when she was 16 that she writes a letter to John MacArthur. Part of that letter to John, talking about what her dad did to her, she apparently puts in that letter, "I don't want you to fire my dad." Now, again, as a 16-year-old, wanting the best for your dad, probably not fully being able to process the situation, I don't think she knew what she was really asking for. And we don't know for a fact that that's why John Tucker and his family left Grace Community Church, but Wendy seems to stay close with her friend, John Tucker's daughter. And I think it's a safe assumption that her guess of why they left was correct. John Tucker seems to have left Grace Community Church because John MacArthur didn't fire Paul Guay. Now, we don't know that. And we don't have a lot of information up until 1982. In fact, we're not provided with any information up to 1982. We just know 3 years went by with Paul on staff. Now, what happens is Paul is fired from Grace Community Church for hugging and kissing a secretary. Him and his wife actually end up leaving the church. They weren't told they had to leave. He just wasn't allowed to be on staff anymore. And they leave shortly after, though, because apparently, according to one of Wendy's emails, as well as sort of her telling her story about her dad was really bitter about being fired because apparently it was fairly public. That's kind of what she alludes to, that John MacArthur publicly fired him, which my guess is it's probably, again, during a communion service when they do the excommunications and they bring up church discipline. It probably happened in a similar way that we saw when Eileen in the last case. I mean, that's probably what upset John, or not John, but Paul. So we have that. He leaves. Now, Paul, between 1982 and 1988, apparently it's kind of vague. Even the Roche report says like she reached out to a couple of these churches. The first one was First Baptist Church of Residia, I guess. And then I can't say the other name, but it's something Bible Church. The point being is that Dan or Paul's sons, I think one of their names is Dan, if I remember right, says that these were the places where Paul either pastored or helped out in these churches. We'll find out later when you read the emails. Basically, what had happened when John fired Paul, he said, "You're not qualified for ministry until you can prove that you can be faithful to your wife, and a good amount of time has gone by," which is basically the wording. Because at the time, the secretary that Paul was fooling around with said they didn't actually commit adultery because they were just kissing and groping and things of that manner. And for whatever reason, they were like, "All right, you didn't commit adultery. So you're just fired because you did this, and you're disqualified from ministry for a time until you can prove you can be faithful to your wife." And Paul got mad at that and he left. Apparently, John MacArthur put out a general statement. It doesn't state that he called the churches around town, but he put out a general statement. We don't know exactly what that means, but about how Paul was not qualified for ministry. Regardless, it seems that Paul got positions, or at least helped out at or pastored at two churches between 1982 and 1988. Which, I mean, I think we can all see as problematic. We know Paul's history. We know what he did. He obviously didn't stop because he was still kissing and hugging a secretary at Grace Community Church. Now, in 1988, we have 9 years go by from the time that Paul's fired. 9 years go by, and Wendy's living in Oregon. She's married. She's got kids. And Lisa, her childhood friend, comes and visits her in Oregon, and she notices that Wendy is not doing well. She's engaging in self-destructive behavior. We don't know what that means. We just know that that's the wording she used. She's not having healthy habits. And she attributes this to the fact that Wendy never got help after the abuse. There was no counseling given to Wendy. As far as we know, there was no counseling given to her father. It was just kind of like, okay, this happened, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. Wendy, I don't think actually mentions that this time of her life she's going through is specifically because of the abuse from her father, but Lisa does definitely connect that. And Lisa is her friend, and she's angry, so she writes a letter to Grace Community Church. I think you can guess where this is going. Lisa doesn't get a response, but she does write a letter in 1988. Now, we skip forward all the way 9 years from then, sorry, to 1997. Now, we've had a huge amount of time go by. There's been so much that we just don't know what happened in between here, other than Wendy is sort of on ups and downs as far as her health and her behavior. And a lot of it she's struggling through, probably because of the abuse and not dealing with it. In fact, in one of the letters that she writes John MacArthur near the end that we'll talk about, she specifically states, like, kind of her goal was just to put it behind her. She hadn't worked through it. She hadn't dealt with it. Her goal was just put it behind her. And so she had kind of been suppressing it, probably, is what had happened. And that had caused some things to happen in her life. Now, in 1977, Paul becomes the pastor of Grace Brethren Church in Washington State. This becomes really important in this story just because of church discipline and things like that. And we'll get to that. So he's a pastor now. He's officially a pastor. We can confirm that in 1997, he became pastor of Grace Brethren Church. Now, in 2003, so 6 years after Paul Guay becomes pastor of Grace Brethren Church, so a lot of time has passed at this point, Wendy finds out about what we talked about at the very beginning of this video. She finds out about Pam being abused. She finds out about Donna attempted to be abused. Her mom tells her about, the promiscuity of her father when they were first married, about how, his second wife came along. And so all of this comes up at once, because up until this point, Wendy thought she was all by herself. Wendy thought it was just her that had been abused by her father. And when she finds about these other people, they decide that they're going to form an intervention. And so this is what they do. It prompts them to set up an intervention with their dad at his church. They contact the elders of the church and they decide, this is what we're going to do. We're going to set up a meeting. Now we go And Wendy emails. This is where we start an email correspondence. Okay. So February 17th of 2003. So she finds out sometime in 2003. We're not sure what months, but in February 17th, 2003, we begin an email correspondence with John MacArthur. Okay. And what happens in this correspondence, the first one, Wendy begins email correspondence with him. And it seems as though there has been some, let me see here. Hold on. I'm sorry. All right, I'm back. So there had been some email correspondence started in 2003. Now, there's a couple things that she mentions in this correspondence. She talks about the fact that they are going to have an intervention with her dad. She talks about, John MacArthur not, she doesn't want John to call her dad and tell him that this is going to happen. She wants to make sure that the intervention happens like it should. And then she's wondering about the extent of sin that John MacArthur knew about from his meetings. How much did John MacArthur know happened? Like, what did her dad tell him? Because she wants to come to this meeting, it seems like, come to this meeting as prepared as possible. And she does tell John MacArthur, my dad didn't like you. He talked about his disdain for you after you fired him. And she actually brings up the fact that to her dad had mentioned, it was her fault that the abuse happened in the first place. So this is the first email she sends to him. Now, the next day, she gets an email back from John's secretary, and it assures her MacArthur won't contact her dad before meeting, and that he doesn't have anything to add to the past interactions with Paul. Now, this is the interesting thing that occurs, and this is why I mentioned that the meeting that John Tucker had with Paul Guay and John MacArthur is important. This is why the letter that John wrote her way back when is important, back in '79, because this email here seems to really be the email that Wendy's like what? Like, what do you mean you don't have anything to add to the conversation? And so she emails him back on February 19th. She emails him back and she replies to John's secretary with a lot of confusion. I mean, she says that she assumed maybe, John can't talk because of maybe legal issues, right? What if my dad had done something to somebody else and, you can't say it because then you could be held liable. She's sort of assuming that that's why John won't talk. And she confesses that she was really looking for wisdom from him. She says that he's a really wise guy. She was looking for confirmation that this was the right thing, or maybe just an apology that it hadn't been dealt with sooner. And that's, now that they have to deal with it, like she was looking for something from him and she wasn't getting anything. And you could tell in the email when you read it, there's a lot of aggravation there. She also mentions that her dad had mentioned to her that John suggested that he's not going back to ministry, and she offers to fax the letter that John wrote her to him, like jog his memory. Like, you don't remember, I get it. There's a lot going on in ministry. I have the letter though. I can fax it to you so you can remember a little bit. And she ends with a concern because that Friday she's going to have to go talk to her brother. I believe February 19th is a Tuesday. And she's concerned because she's going to have to go talk to her brother. He doesn't know that any of this has happened. She's concerned that he won't believe her. And again, she's concerned for her dad's repentance. Again, this Wendy is a saint. She's still, even now, hoping that her dad will repent and ask for forgiveness for what he had done to her. Well, that same day, John's secretary responds and assures Wendy that, John doesn't have anything to add, not because of any legal situation, but because, that nothing happened. And then she cites church policy. Like, if anything happens with, the M word or the P word, then they contact law enforcement right away. And she follows up by saying that no one, including John MacArthur, had any knowledge of the situation with Paul because Paul never confessed anything to John. Now, this is the thing that really sets off the next email. The next email that we're not going to look at it, obviously, but if you pull it up, it is an incredibly painful email to read in regards to sort of, I mean, you can just read the distrust, the heartbreak, the what do you mean you didn't know anything? And the secretary does point to to the fact that, like, no, when your dad did something with the secretary, we fired him because we have a no tolerance policy, but we didn't know of anything before, because if we would have, then we would have definitely fired him before that if we would have known anything. But in the letter, she says John doesn't know anything because Paul never confessed anything to him. So February 20th is the letter that's really hard to read. So if you look it up, that's the one you're going to look for if you want to read it all. It's very painful. It's very hard to read. It's very long. It's very detailed. But Wendy replies to MacArthur's secretary, but addresses it to MacArthur specifically about the concerns that her dad doesn't think things correctly. He doesn't think anything's wrong unless, certain things happen during this interaction that he's done with all of these people. And she recounts her story. Like, she goes, I thought what did my dad confess to you then if he didn't confess the abuse? Like, I wrote you a letter. Like, what did you think I was writing you? Like, when I said what I said in my letter, what did you take that abuse as? If like, what did you take that abuse as if not abuse? Like, I think in the letter she actually says, do we have a different definition of the M word? Because clearly that's the only way this works out. Like, you can tell in this letter, she's upset. Her trust is broken. She's very confused. She doesn't know why in the world he wouldn't know anything about the situation. And all of this is bubbling up, it seems like. Now, this is just my assumption read onto what's happening, but I think it's a safe one. Is that Friday, she's got to go tell her brother all of this. She doesn't know how her brother's going to react. March 1st is when they're going to end up doing the intervention. So clearly that's close because it's February 20th. She's probably under a great amount of stress. Not only is she under a great amount of stress, she's the primary victim here. And she's the one that's having to sort of orchestrate this and bring this about. So her stress is probably clearly sort of expected in this situation. And you can tell in that letter, she's just heartbroken that MacArthur says that nothing's going on. So March 1st happens. March 1st is the day that the intervention occurs. And there is a ton of people at the intervention. It has the Grace Brethren Church elders there. It has Wendy and Donna and Pam. Her mom writes a letter. John Tucker sends a letter in regards to what he witnessed. Like, there's a lot of information. And according to her brother, I believe it's her brother or her, at the meeting, at this intervention on March 1st, 2003, the elders of Grace Brethren Church were kind of really taken back by all the things that were being told to them that their pastor had done in the past, right? I mean, you can imagine if you're sitting down there's your pastor, and you hear about all of this terrible things that we've talked about up to this point in this video. He's done these things, and you're like, I mean, that would be shocking, right? So they're done, and they tell all of this, and what they're seeking is his repentance and his removal from ministry. So it's one of those things where you're like, oh, okay, that's good. It's out there. They know about it. The bad thing is the statute of limitations in California had already expired. So it's not like Paul could be tried for any of this or convicted of any of this, but at least it's out there. And they had a lot of hope that, the elders seemed to be as disgusted as they were that it happened. And they had a lot of hope that, the right thing would be reached. Well, on March 13th, so 12 days later, the Grace Brethren elders, or the Grace Brethren Church elders, get back with the family and tell them that they've decided to keep Paul on as pastor, even though they know all of this stuff that had happened. It's not that they, and here's the thing. Here's the thing. They do not know, and it's not that they do not know. It's they know that what they were told was like correct. They understand these are actual facts of actual events that actually happened to the people that were in front of them that told them this. In every reasonable way to deal about this scripturally, Paul is not qualified for ministry anymore. Like, in any regard, like, you can't like reason that away. he shouldn't be pastor of this church. But they decide, according to the letter that is a part of the report. I forget whose letter it is. I think it's Wendy's. But according to the brethren, the Grace Brethren Church, well, there were a lot of sinners in the Bible that God used later, like David and Saul and all of that. That was the reasoning they used to keep Paul on. Which, just as a side note, this is why we should all be in the Bible. This is why we should all be using discernment. This is why we should be able to just be like, yeah, that's a terrible way to use scripture. That's not right. I mean, but they keep him on. Okay. So, not to distract from what we're on here, but but why in the world would Grace Brethren Church keep Paul Guay on is beyond me. Anyway, that happened March 13th. Now, at some point between April 12th and April 18th, John MacArthur and Wendy speak on the phone. And John MacArthur emails her after this. Now, we don't know what happened on the phone. Wendy reports that he was sort of upset. He talked in an angry tone to her, she said, I think, is that how it's worded in the report. But all of that, we don't even know what was said. We just know they did talk. But we do get a follow-up email. In that email from April 18th that he emails her back, MacArthur recounts what he knows about the situation and talks about the policy. He basically repeats the same policy that the secretary had sent Wendy to begin with when Wendy was asking her questions. He does admit that he called her dad to ask about the situation and admits to taking his word on the matter. Now, two things on this. It seems as if MacArthur honored her wishes and did not call her dad until after the intervention had happened. But in the email that she sent him, and I would encourage, again, all of this stuff, go read all of this stuff. In the email that she sent him before the intervention back in February, she said that she was going to follow up with all of the people involved to make sure that she was recounting the situation correctly, that she understood that John Tucker's word that her dad had in John's presence admitted to all these things to John MacArthur. She mentioned that she was going to call her mom's brother-in-law, the pastor, and verify that, okay, this is what you had heard. And she encouraged MacArthur to do the same thing. Apparently, MacArthur doesn't call anybody but Paul Guay to verify, hey, Paul, what did you tell me initially? Well, I told you I rubbed her back. Okay. And then John just takes Paul's word for it and doesn't call anyone else. Now, no, we'll get to that in a minute. So he doesn't call anybody else. At the very end of the email, you can read it. He seems very sort of dismissive, unkind in addressing the situation, tells her she's become obsessed with it. And you can just read it. Like it's an odd way to speak to someone that has been abused. So let's keep going. So 2012, right? So we're back in 2003. Now we're in 2012. Paul is still the pastor of Grace Brethren Church. So all these years have passed. We're in 2012. Paul's still the pastor of this church. And Paul actually dies at this church. Not at the church, but he gets cancer. He dies the pastor of this church, and he gets cancer. And then nothing. Like, there was never any punishment for Paul. There was never any accountability for Paul. If you read the reports, what you know is that he downplayed all of the things he did to other people, not only in the meeting with the elders, but one of the, I guess, stipulations to him to stay pastor was to go to a counselor. And he went to a counselor for a while, but according to the documents he wrote to the counselor, he downplayed everything he did to the counselor as well. I think they said he went to like 9 sessions and then that's it. And then he's still the pastor until he dies. And nothing, that's where it ended, which is crazy. Now, one of the things that she does, there is an email, and I thought I had the slide here. I clearly don't have the slide here. But one of the emails she sends to the secretary, because she had all of these questions when she had that email where she went off. She She was heartbroken. Her trust was broken. Like, she was super confused. That email that she sends off, I believe it was February. I'm sorry. Let's go back real quick. February 20th, I think. Um, I'm sorry. I thought I had that slide in there. I clearly don't. In the slide, though, in one of the last emails she sends to the secretary, because the secretary sends her an email and says, "Hey, sorry we haven't been able to get back to you. There's been a lot going on. John wasn't in the office. We've got all your stuff." This happens actually before John calls her, so clearly I didn't miss a slide. But this all happens before John calls her. In the email, she sends back to the secretary. She says she talked to somebody. The name is redacted at the top of the document. We have no idea who she talked to, but whoever she talked to, she says, was very helpful in explaining that John didn't know what was going on. Now, here's the interesting part, because I saw a video this morning of somebody, and I won't mention who it is because it's not important, but they made a video on it, and they used that line from her email to say, "Oh, look, John's not guilty," because in her email, she says, I thought he was part of a cover up, and now I know he's not." And they use that line to be like, see, he's exonerated from it, because even Wendy, the victim, said that he's not part of a cover up, even though she initially thought he was. You got to read the rest of the email. The rest of the email, she basically lands on the reality with whoever she talked to, and we don't know who it is because it's redacted. Whoever she talked to basically cleared it up and said that John didn't know what was going on, but he didn't know what was going on because he actually looked into it. He didn't know what was going on because he was like, I think Wendy's words is like, he was negligent. Like, he didn't put in the time or the effort to actually explore if what had said to be happened actually happened. So I think she calls him willfully ignorant or something along those lines. The idea that she doesn't blame him because he didn't cover it up. He just didn't even try. Like, you can read it. It sounds very sarcastic, where she's like, yeah, no, he didn't know because he didn't even try to know. He didn't put it in the time or the effort that he should have known. And that's kind of how it reads. I don't know if that's how she wrote it, but there's like it's normally typed, and there's certain words that are all caps, seems to indicate, like, obviously, like, this word stronger. So it seems to be like this letter where she's not exonerating him. She's just going, he didn't know. He was willfully ignorant of the situation because he did not put in the time that he should have to investigate the situation. And that's where she landed in 2003, was that he was willfully ignorant of the situation. Now, if you read on in the report, I don't have slides for this, but Wendy went on to become like an abuse counselor, trauma, or something like that. And she's got her life together. She's worked through it. She's helping other people. Like, God has brought something beautiful from an absolute terrible mess, is what's happened. And she came forward to talk to Julia Royce because of what she saw come out on the Gray, when the Royce report put out the whole thing about the Grays. And here, let me get rid of this. This isn't necessary anymore. So she came forward and talked to Julia after she saw the Gray thing. And she's afraid, and she mentions this in the email. I forgot to mention this too. I'm sorry. There's a slide I clearly forgot. But she mentions in the slide that the fact that John MacArthur, in her view, was willfully ignorant of the situation put a bunch of people at risk. She says in that email that she wouldn't be surprised if more people came forward with the same story, because her dad was there for 3 years. Who knows what he could have done in 3 years while he was there, just at Grace, not to name the other churches he went to. And she says she doesn't know what she's going to do about it. She considered in 2003 writing an article for the LA Times. She clearly didn't do that. But when she saw the Gray report, she decided to come forward and tell her story. So I want to cover one thing before I get into kind of the conclusion here. So if she's right in regards to, like, she doesn't think she's the only one. And we know for a fact that whenever, like, things happen, like somebody breaks silence about abuse, that gives other people like a doorway to do the same. Like, because they thought, just like Wendy thought, they were the only one, and they find out they're not the only one. And that gives them like a little bit of courage to come forward. This is why Wendy came forward. Wendy came forward because she saw the Gray report, and she thought, I need to tell my story. So here's the thing. I made a post today on Instagram. Clearly, I could have done a better job of explaining what I was talking about. The heart of it was this, though, that oftentimes, whenever anything happens, we jump on one or the other side. Like, we don't even consider the information. We just go, oh, I'm on this team, and you fall on that team. And I've seen that happen ever since the first report that, well, not the first report, but the Gray report, when the Roy's report dropped that one, I saw that immediately. I've mentioned that in my past videos. Like, automatically, people went on one side or the other. I mean, the dividing line was clear. And I've seen that every single time that a report's been dropped. And I know people are doing it because there are people that I asked, did you read every link? Like, all of it? And some people are honest and they'll tell me no, because it takes hours to do this. Okay. It takes hours to read through it, see where everything fits, get all the information, process it. And there's no way within the first hour that a Roy's report drops that somebody has done all that. They pick a side. Now, not everybody's doing that, but we do that. And we need to fight against that urge to follow one or the other side without actually looking at the evidence. Now, that being said, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, sorry, hold on. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is a different report than the ones that have been dropped before. Because as I mentioned, if you watch my other videos, John was separated from the situations in between a few people at least. This one, he's in it, like direct contact with people. Now, the Roy's report title was, did he, what was the exact title? Something about hiding or cover up child abuse or a child abuser. So there's three things reading through this, looking at the information. There are four scenarios that people have come to that I've seen online in this so far, four of them. The first one is that John purposefully hid, in this case, Paul Guay. That Paul did admit to him in the office what he had done, like John Tucker said, and John just didn't do anything about it. In one of Wendy's letters, she writes and says that her dad told her that John had a conversation with him that if he ever did anything again, the littlest thing, he was gone. Give me 1 second. Sorry, something's in my throat. So she wrote that in one of her letters, that her dad told her that John MacArthur told him that if he did one more thing, he was gone and fired. So the idea that John purposefully hid the abuse isn't totally out of the question. There seems to be some evidence for that. The second one is that sort of where Wendy landed back in 2003, which is that John put himself in a situation in which he could plead plausible deniability. He put himself in a situation that if asked, he could say he didn't know anything and therefore not be liable for anything. And that seems to be, at least in 2003, where Wendy landed. Now, if you read the article, Wendy has since got to the point where she's went to point one. She thinks that John MacArthur just hid abusers. But in 2003, she was of the mind that he was just willfully ignorant and he put himself in a state of plausible deniability. Then there's another one that I've seen online, which is that John MacArthur and Grace Community Church have information that the public doesn't have that explains some of the things that we don't know. I'm sure you've heard this one. I mean, we saw it a lot during the Gray case, or the report about the Grays. And then in that instance, that scenario sort of fits because you're talking about legality, you're talking about arrests, you're talking about trials, you're talking about all that sort of stuff. So maybe in that case, that excuse or that kind of line of thinking would have worked. But here, there's no litigation. There's no red tape to cut through. There's not really, as far as we can even tell, any counseling sessions that took place that that would have like a confidentiality part. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't. I'm just saying that that's not the information we have. And then the fourth option, which I've seen, but I think is to believe you'd have to be taking an enormous amount of coping medicine, coping medicine, but that John is telling the truth and the victims are all lying or exaggerating what they've said. Um, if you take that path, I mean, you're literally talking about at least 8 people just in this report that are lying, and that just doesn't make sense. They have nothing to gain from that at all. I mean, there's no reason for them to do that. So there are people that hold point 4, but that doesn't seem like it's illogical. It doesn't make any sense at all to hold that position. If you hold that position, you I mean, what at what point would you not trust John MacArthur? Because at that point you're just saying everybody but him's wrong. There is a possibility for point 3 that there may be something we don't know that's not included in the Royce report. I think we have to keep that option open because that's just the reality. We don't know what we have and we don't know what we don't have. We know what we have, and what we have is incredibly terrible. And if this is everything, I mean, we'll get to that in a minute, but we have to at least leave this up to the reality that there may be information that Grace Community Church and John MacArthur haven't said. And I'll say this again. I think I've said it in every single video. It would do a world of good for Grace Community Church to make a statement. Any statement. Just anything. A prayer hands emoji. I mean, anything. Just say something about it. Even if you're wrong, even if you messed up, like you don't here, and I've said this before. Those of us outside of Grace Community Church, like we're not members of the community. That's not our shepherds. Those aren't our elders. They don't really owe us anything, though that would be nice. But they would at least, if you're a member of Grace Community Church, owe you an explanation because you're part of that body. You're a part of the community. So the biblical thing to do, if you're part of Grace Community Church, is to go to your elders and say, look, I am a member here. This is what you would do with any community. If this is your local body, if something was happening at my church, somebody accused my pastor of something, I would go to him and say, look, I am a member here. I have put myself under your spiritual authority. Up to this point, you have proven yourself to be biblically based, Jesus loving, scripture following. That's why I'm here. This is the accusation, though. Could you please explain this? Because I love you. I go here for a reason. I want my family to grow in Christ. You were the shepherd over us. And that could be what would happen. So anyway, and then the last one would be that he did hide the abuse. So let's go to a couple questions. If you have questions, drop them in the comment section. Those are the 4 scenarios that I've seen. The top 2, I think, are the most viable. I don't know where I've come down on it, to be honest with you. So let's see what's going on here. Show this. All right, show this comment. You say it's incredibly terrible. If this is the case, what do you think should happen to John MacArthur? If it's scenario 1, and Paul Guay actually admitted to him that he had done something to his daughter in the form of abuse, aka the M word, he's gone. I mean, why would he not be gone? He's clearly has broken the qualifications for an elder at that point. Now, again, you have to prove that. And that's incredibly hard to prove now because Paul Guay is dead. You can talk to John Tucker because John Tucker, as far as I know, is still alive. But then it's basically John Tucker's word against John MacArthur's word. Now, I think there is a ton of validity to the fact that Paul called Wendy and told her he had confessed. I think there's a lot of validity to the fact that Wendy wrote MacArthur a letter telling him about what her father had done to her, and he wrote a letter back to her. So I don't really buy, given the information that we have, that he didn't know. He seems to have known. So what should happen to John MacArthur? Well, there's a reason that you have elders in your church to hold you accountable. And if your elders don't hold you accountable, then that's what the congregation's there for. The members of the body are there to say, either say, I want explanation for this accusation against you, because again, elders are supposed to be, one of the qualifications is above reproach, as well as outsiders should look favorably upon you. Now, again, we've talked about that before. It's not like they're going to like you all the time, but if somebody brings a case against you, I think is it what, first, second Peter, they should be put to shame because your testimony proves that that's not true, like the case they brought against you. So the elders and the church members should exercise biblical sort of authority to do that. Because it seems like to me, given the information we have, that John MacArthur knew. So next question. But didn't he actually admit to John that he had the M word Wendy? That is what seems to be the consistent story. Yes. It seems that he may have denied it at first. This is what his first wife says happened, that he denied it to MacArthur at first. But John Tucker says that he admitted it to MacArthur. Paul called Wendy and said he admitted it to MacArthur. Wendy wrote him a letter. I mean, everything we just talked about. Like, it seems to be the case that John MacArthur knew. And if that is the case, then there should be, within the church, as I've already stated, elders that hold John MacArthur accountable, or at least go through the biblical process of trying to see if this is true. And if this is true, right? So this is what it means. If I'm an elder at Grace Community Church, what I then do is take the accusation that is presented, and then I talk to Wendy, and I talk to her mom. Now, the bad thing is that Jane, his second wife, apparently has dementia and isn't well. So she's not going to be able to give a ton of information. But we do talk to Wendy. We talk to John Tucker again. Like, there's certain things that they can do. So it's not like we're up a creek. There's still people alive that the elders of Grace Community Church could talk to hold an investigation to ensure that this was handled correctly. And if it was, okay, John's good. If it wasn't, then you exercise biblical discipline. So here's a question. Do you think the Christian investigation journalism is a fruitful ministry? Should it be a thing? It's a good question. The reality is that, so let's go back to the Bible, right? So when Paul writes to the Corinthians, for example, the reason he writes to the Corinthians is because they are at one of the reasons is they're asking him questions, and my brain is fogged right now. But I think if it's not the Corinthian church, it's another one. He hears about what's happening at that church. We'll say it's Corinth because I can't remember. And then he writes back to them. Now, this is clearly a different situation because Paul is a spiritual father to them. He's got elders set up in these churches. So this isn't the same type of scenario. By no means is Christian journalism the Paul to the churches. I'm not saying that. That's a ridiculous connection. But there is something to be said of people outside of the church saying, hey, you're not acting like the Bible says you should, and then pointing that out. Again, as I've said, unless you're a member of Grace Community Church, there's really not a lot of biblical pathways for you to address this because you're not part of that community. Those aren't your elders. There's not a process for you to go through. But there is a way to at least point out and say that's inconsistent with what the Bible says and sort of sound the alarm a bit and say, like, do you not see this inconsistency as well? We do this all the time with pastors. Well, I mean, people will get online all the time and say that pastor's not preaching correctly. They're heretical. They said this or that doctrine's not right, and point it out. So it's one of those things where, I think let's put it this way, done in the right spirit, it can be incredibly helpful. I don't think it's often done in the right spirit. I've said this before on previous videos. there are things, and this report is one of them too, that there are parts of the report that seem clearly written in order to sort of lean a direction, and instead of saying you look into this yourself, it seems to lean a direction and sort of, it wants to help you make a conclusion in a certain direction. I don't think that's helpful. I think putting forth the information and saying, here it is, you look at it, here's the timeline. I mean, that's my attempt. I'm not saying, hopefully this is helpful to you. For me, it was really beneficial because now I can just see the facts, lay them out, at least the facts that I have, lay them out and say, what's the conclusion then? And I think that's helpful. It can be divisive. Um, it can be unhelpful, but I think done in the right way. Even though I'll say this and we'll move on to the next question. One of the things that I think can come from it, like this, right? So I've said before, I'll say it on this one. I don't agree with the tone and sort of the I wouldn't say twisting, but definitely the way that the reports are written are to direct you in a certain direction. I mean, you can deny that, but you read them and they're meant to lead you down a certain path. I don't like that about them. But what I do appreciate about them is that they do have all of the information in there for you to look at. So every time I've looked at a Royce report, I'll read the whole thing once, get the links, and then I'll make a timeline. Because I don't really care how the report's written. That to me isn't really helpful. I'd rather just you give me the information and then I look at it myself. So yes, I guess long answer short, it can be beneficial. I often think it's not though. So one more thing here. Personally, I dislike it because it taints the church in a bad or paints the church in a bad light. And if anything, it gives justification for unbelievers to harden their hearts to Christianity. Well, yes. So on that point, let me say this. Um, I think that if churches exercised policy in the way that is outlined in scripture and had biblically qualified elders in the way that is outlined in scripture, churches would run in a manner as they were designed to do. But because oftentimes we don't have an eldership structure as scripture shows, because oftentimes church discipline isn't exercised in a way that it should be, then you have all of this sort of abuse that has to be brought up by people that aren't in those churches to catch it when it should have been caught in the church. So yeah, it definitely gives fodder to unbelievers and deconstructionists and those that are already mad at the church. It gives them plenty of wood to throw more gasoline on, no doubt. But it is also helpful to say, okay, well, how? I think I've said this in one of my videos as well. Whenever you see this happen, for example, at Grace Community Church, clearly, as I've already stated, you can't do much about it because you're not a part of that community. Biblically, you have no real line of to do much. You're not a part. Those aren't your elders. But what you can do is say, okay, at my local community, what can I do? What questions can I ask my elders? What policy do we maybe not have that we can put in place to make sure that doesn't happen? And I think that's where situations like this are helpful because it can make us think about what are we doing in our local communities to prevent all of this mess right here. Because guys, I'll get to this next thing this next comment that's coming up. But one of the things that you have to understand is like, and I think you may understand this, but one sin in the church committed by one person has a ripple effect through the whole body. And I'm not just talking a little ripple effect. Like I think looking at Paul Guay is a perfect example of the fact that Paul does a number of things that he doesn't think affects anything or he thinks he can get away with. And we're talking about it today in 2022 because sin just rolls down the hill like a snowball until the gospel eviscerates it and breaks it up and changes families and changes lives and stops that generational just trauma that keeps being passed down because this person was hurt. So now they hurt their kids in a different way because they don't know how to cope. And it just keeps going until Jesus steps in and saves that person. And then everybody past them is now different because of the gospel. So what's this right here? I didn't see this. I've tried to be pretty careful with the case on my channel. I know it needs to be talked about, but I don't like to have all, but I feel like I need to have all the info, and it just makes me feel weird talking about other folks. Yeah. So this is a good point, right? And this is why I think that we need to be really careful about how we're kind of throwing things out, right? So my goal here, and I hope it's happened efficiently, is just presenting the information, saying here are sort of the 4 things I've seen laid out. You need to look at the information and you need to make your call. Right now, I don't know what the truth is. Right? Did he hide an abuser? Well, if he did, he needs to be gone. Did he distance himself so he didn't have liability? That's almost just as bad. Like there's no real good outcome here. But again, other than saying, hey, elders at GCC, hey, members at GCC, are you aware of this? There's not a lot that can happen. And to be frank with you, hopefully this is not the case. But if it is the case that there's more people that have actually been abused because of situations like this, I would hope that they would come forward so that we can they can heal. This can get out in the open. Like I pray that that is not the case. But if it is, hopefully this will give them the courage to come forward and say something. Because honestly, I don't think there's a lot of people that can jump to conclusions about John MacArthur and what should happen and call for his resignation. But we have biblical steps that are set up for that. And if the elders don't take those accounts seriously, and the members don't step up and take the account seriously, the one of the only recourses that people outside of the church are left with are to say, okay, well, until you make a statement, until you at least address the issue, I'm just going to kind of step away from John MacArthur Ministries, Grace to You Ministries, because I don't have a clear line of sight whether you're handling things biblically or not. And I know that's hard for a lot of people because John MacArthur has helped a lot of people. John MacArthur has had 50 years or more of like what do they say? Like faithful ministry, right? So that's why a lot of people are saying, no, there's no way he did it. But I think if you look at the information, you at least have to say it's a possibility. And until I know for sure, that it's not the case, then I'm going to have to step away and say, I don't know if I can recommend you anymore. Maybe none of it's true, but until you take the biblical steps to address the issues being brought in front of you, until you do something, there has to be a point where people say, okay, I've benefited from John MacArthur. I've got a lot from his ministry. But until something is said, I'm just going to have to step away and be like, I don't know about you anymore. I'm not. And I think that's a way to say, look, I'm giving you the grace to take the time to actually address the issues. And if you don't, then you've pretty much said what needs to be said, that you don't care to do it in a biblical way. So one last thing, and I think we'll head off. Very interested to see how many dislikes this video has. If we all knew the 10th of all the sin that was going on in our local church, we would be appalled. There you go. That is a good point. And this will be a good place to end because we've been going for a little over an hour now. I don't know how many pastors you know personally. I've got a lot of friends that are pastors. I've got a friend right now that is dealing with a church discipline situation, specifically dealing with abuse. And I can tell you that the elders of that church are doing everything they humanly can to address the abused, to get help for the abuser and the abused, to speak Christ into that situation, that there is hope, that there is redemption, that there is repentance. There needs to be this repentance and this call out to Jesus. And it is weighing on them more than you could possibly imagine. And there is a point, and I know people don't like to hear this, but you need to pray for your pastors. You do. Because I mean, you don't see all they go through, and maybe you feel like they whine a lot, but I'm telling you, there is so much weight on their shoulders for the care of their people, to make sure that they shepherd them well, that they give them the gospel, that they're being discipled. And as all of that's happening, there's a whole bunch of mess occurring over here, like a big bunch of mess of sin. And they are front lines, front and center to it. They see all of it. They're counseling through it. They're dealing with it. And that weighs heavily on them. So pray for your pastors, because again, these situations are not easy to deal with. These situations aren't easy to deal with for the victims. These situations, there's so much going on with the perpetrators, probably in their past. Not that that's an excuse for them, but the reality is you have to deal with that. And then the pastor is not only trying to deal with this situation, but everybody else's stuff too. So first of all, before we all get to jumping on our pastors about how terrible they are and how they should have done something and we would have done it differently, pray for them. Because they are the ones that are supposed to be biblically the shepherds over your souls. They're supposed to be leading you, teaching you. And that involves a lot more than I think a lot of people know if you've never been in that position. So that's all I'll say about that. Looks like we do have one more question. We'll take that, and then we will end this thing. Do you think that someone having a public ministry changes whether they are accountable to that wider community as well as their own church? That is an excellent question. So here's the thing. We don't have any biblical guidance for that specifically. Now, there does seem to be this idea of like that what we see. I think the closest thing would be like false teachers in the church, like that come in that are from the outside that are teaching, different doctrines. That would be maybe the first thing that I can think of that's even close to that, because they are from the outside. They're not elders of that church. So it's one of those things where I think at that point, here's where it gets difficult. There is such a misunderstanding of what it means to be a part of your local church that people actually think and actually call people like John MacArthur or people like Stephen Furtick or a number of other really big pastors. They call them their pastor, but they've never stepped foot in the building. They've never actually attended a service. They're never going to be there and go there. And they think that because they listen to them all the time, that that's their pastor, and they ignore what their actual local church pastor says and listen to whoever this big name guy is instead. That's not biblical. That's totally off base. I say all that to say this, to address the question. We, as pastors specifically, and as Christians in general, we need to have a better understanding and teach a biblical understanding of what it means to be a part of the local community, which means putting yourself under biblically qualified elders, which means being taught by those biblically qualified elders, which means being discipled and held accountable to those biblically qualified elders. And when those elders show themselves not to be biblically qualified, we have ways to bring that up and to get biblically qualified elders in their position and the unqualified ones out. We need to really stop with this nonsense is that, I attend this church. It's kind of my church. No one here really has any authority over me. They can't tell me what to do. That's simply not biblical. There is a biblical model of church that we see built out in the New Testament. And again, as I said earlier in this video, if we understood that better and implemented that better, we probably wouldn't have as many of these huge mega church guys that everybody's like, that's my dude. And he's not your dude. Who's your local pastor? Who's your local pastor? Who's been put over you? So, do I think that people that have public ministry should be accountable to the wider community? That's not biblical. It's our fault for putting them on a pedestal to make them this big, huge thing. And it's their local church's fault for not holding them accountable to the things that the people outside see as wrong. So, anyway, all right, guys, hopefully that was helpful to you. The timeline was helpful. Hopefully those answers were helpful. To sum it up, in case you missed it, you're just catching the end here. There's only a couple explanations after you look at this information, and you need to look at the information and make your call. Personally, I have to withhold any recommendation of Grace Community Church currently to anybody until I can get some sort of conclusion on what happened. Maybe more information comes out. Maybe they release information and it clarifies the Royce stuff. This will be the last video I do on it, though, just so you know. Like, I'm kind of done with this. I spent way too much time doing this, and they're not even my local church. And I need to spend more time doing stuff on my local church, as we all should. So hopefully you guys did find this helpful. Hopefully you found it clarifying. But ultimately, what I would tell you to do is be in your Bibles, use biblical discernment, and be a part of your local church. And if you want to exercise some sort of biblical, like, hey, we're not doing this right, look to our churches first, learn from the mistakes of others, and then preach the gospel. All right, guys, I'll talk to you later. See ya.